Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. India claims steadfast commitment to environmental laws and an upward trend in regulatory enforcement, but there is a glaring duality. At COP27, India claimed to lead the charge on the climate crisis. At the same time, the government opened more coal blocks for auctions and announced a renewed commitment to polluting coal fired power. The government says it is committed to preserving India's green zones, but then moves to destroy the lush Hasdev forest through a mining push. It uses a change in the definition of what constitutes a forest to show increasing forest cover. Is India serious about environmental laws and their compliance?
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Susan L Ostermann, Assistant Professor of Global Affairs and Political Science at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She completed her PhD in the Travers Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. She also holds a law degree from Stanford Law School and was a practicing litigator for several years, focusing on class action and intellectual property disputes. Employing both quantitative and qualitative methodology, Susan seeks to understand the relationship between state capacity, coercion, and law. Her recently published book, Capacity Beyond Coercion, develops the concept of regulatory pragmatism to explain variation in strategies used by Nepal and India to secure compliance with conservation, education, and child labor regulations. Susan, welcome.
Thank you, Ashraf. Glad to be here.
Susan, while the environment minister boarded the flight to Sharm el Sheikh for COP27, the finance minister announced India's biggest ever coal mine auction with 141 new sites on the block. She said India needs greater investment in coal production, justifying it by pointing to rising fossil fuel prices. Now, burning coal is the most polluting method of generating electricity. How do you react to this duality?
Well, there's a real tension that exists in the world, as well as, frankly, in the scholarship, between supplying the power necessary for development and achieving environmental goals. Part of this stems from the fact that it is particularly costly for those living at the margins, the poor, to prioritize the environment over their survival, for instance, even though realistically these are actually deeply intertwined. And the rural poor, in particular, know this quite well. There's a really fantastic documentary that I show in my development studies and South Asian politics classes. It's called Katyabaz. It's about 10 years old. And it's about the politics of electricity supply in Kanpur. Really shows how necessary electricity is for development, but also how challenging it is to supply enough of it and what happens when people are faced with resource scarcity. Now, India has a growing economy and struggles to keep up with associated energy demands. Its cities are also some of the most polluted places on earth, and it actually doesn't have to be this way. There is a lot of sunshine and other renewable opportunities, but the existing infrastructure is focused on coal, and path dependency does suggest that the government will follow the path of least resistance until forced to do otherwise.
The domestic coal requirement is expected to rise to 1,018.2 million tons by 2031-32 from 678 million tons in 2021-22, an increase of 40%. Given this, how would the world view India's climate commitments?
I think that already the world views India's climate commitments with some skepticism. There are large-scale investments in renewables, especially solar. I really remember a long time ago now when I flew into the airport in Kochi, I was super impressed by all of the solar panels that you see lining the runway. So Kerala was in many ways out front almost 10 years ago. There are, of course, other large-scale projects in Gujarat, et cetera, but the government could do way more. In Pakistan, for instance, a place I've spent a bunch of time doing research over the last year and a half or so, a combination of government subsidies and increasingly low solar prices and expensive and intermittent local energy supply have led to a lot of rooftop solar installations. I just don't see the same installation rates in India. And arguably, there is an economic case to be made for solar in India, even in the absence of government subsidies, particularly for India's 400 million plus strong middle class. This leaves me wondering if your average Indian understands where their power comes from and what it's doing to the world and, frankly, to their own bodies.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the average Indian actually knows where their power is coming from and what it's doing to the world. And since we spoke about India's climate commitments and how the world views them, There is also the commitment to forests. 5 blocks in Hasdevaran's 420,000 acres were identified for auction in order to extract the estimated 5 billion tons of coal that lie underneath them. How do you react?
Well, not with surprise. um, the BJP, of course, is pro-business and pro-development, and frankly, it has to be at least the latter, and certainly the former is related. Swachh Bharat is not really an environmental policy, and the BJP is not truly pro-environment, in my opinion. When it comes down to it, this administration seems to always prioritize development. They might say they're in a race to develop so that they can be green, but I wonder whether this isn't actually analogous to China's race to be rich before the population ages. Given the incredibly low rate of job creation in India over the recent past, India may well end up with not enough of the spoils of development to go around, and also with a completely spoiled environment.
What's the link between such state dominance and internal insurgency? I'm referring to Naxalism. Have you observed anything on the ground in the course of your research?
Definitely. I mean, this is incredibly common, right? There's certainly a well-documented relationship between land issues, and I would use the word land alienation, and internal insurgency. My colleague at Notre Dame, Madhav Joshi, who's Nepali, has written on land tenure and support for insurgency in Nepal. What I've seen on the ground during the almost 2 years of fieldwork I did along the border for the book project that we'll talk about later was deep frustration with government policies related to land more generally and to forests in particular. One woman I spoke to who lived at a very subsistence level just outside of Chitwan National Park in Nepal said that she supported the park in general, that it was good for tourism and the local economy, but that she was now forced to quote unquote steal the firewood she uses to cook and heat her home. Her family had lived in the area for ages. She was Tharu, and this is their ancestral land. Now, it's not as if Tharus in particular gave disproportionate support to the Maoist conflict in Nepal, but this kind of situation occurred all over the country. And you could see why Maoist claims would resonate. It's not as if Tharus didn't know how to manage their local forests sustainably. The same was true across the border in India. Outside of Valmiki National Park and Tiger Reserve in Paschim Champaran, there was a separate Naxalite movement that was quite violent and had taken hold for quite some time. It was easing at the time that I was there. Basically, if you give forest-dependent people no way to continue their lifestyle, they are essentially forced to fight back. That is what I have observed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because even when we talk about the Hasdevaran forest, understandably, the tribals who claimed they were being chased off their land protested. But this isn't the only instance. There have been any number of instances of tribals who've been part of the forest for centuries, who've been told that the forest is no longer theirs, and they would have to even pay in some way for the produce that sustains them or keep their hands off it.
Yes, I would say incredibly common, and not just, it's not a South Asia thing. It's incredibly common and sometimes done for conservation reasons as well. So it's not just development and pro-business that leads to land alienation. For instance, Chitwan National Park that I spoke about just before, when it was formed, there was a population living on park land. And when the park was formed, they were literally removed and relocated in order to foster conservation, which is arguably a good goal. There's some logic to this, but it's not as if their presence had actually degraded the parkland during the centuries that they had resided there. So I would say that there are other ways to proceed. And actually in India and in Nepal, this is changing. Governments are seemingly coming to realize that locals often know more about preserving forests than they do. We have analogous programs in place in both countries. So joint forest management in India and community forestry in Nepal are successful examples of this different approach.
And, just coming back to the insurgencies piece, what you're speaking about has been the root of so many insurgencies. You spoke about Nepal, we've spoken about India, but also Latin America.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why Maoism and some aspects of Marxism more generally take root in various places in the world. Certainly, this has been seen in Latin America as well, in native communities. So in Peru in particular, also in Bolivia, I've seen some really, I haven't done research there, not on this issue anyway, but I've seen similar issues in sub-Saharan Africa as well. Not exactly Maoism, but there's a resonance actually with some Islamic fundamentalist movements that where people are essentially rejecting government domination, and there are ways that they do that.
Now, the Indian State of Forest Report 2021 claimed an increase of 2,261 square kilometers in the total forest and tree cover. Experts said it was the result of the government changing its definition of a forest. Now, tea estates, coconut plantations, and even tree lined avenues are being classified as forests. The definition includes lands of at least 1 hectare area and with 10% or more tree cover, regardless of the tree species or the purpose for which they were grown or their ownership. So, even mango orchards and homestead gardens of suburban housing developments in congested cities are classified as forests. Again, this is an example of regulations being observed in letter, but the ground reality is very different.
That's absolutely true. My reaction, at least at first blush, is that it's not wrong to be more accurate, right? We can all do a better job of actually counting what's there. And it's important to note that in terms of climate change, every tree actually does count, no matter its location. What I think is underhanded is the effort to change the definition to make it seem as if forest cover has increased. That's just silly. And I would say that the proof is ultimately in the pudding, to sort of use a very colloquial English expression. Satellite imagery analysis for forest cover and carbon release and sequestration is very accurate. And if you're not moving that needle, you're just fooling yourself. Of course, humans and their governments do love to fool themselves. So that's where we are right now.
Incidentally, there's a lot of creeping encroachment on our actual forests. Villagers on the boundaries encroach upon the forest, often tree by tree, square meter by square meter, and they say they need it for agriculture and grazing. Such human environment conflict is a severe strain on even environmental law compliance, isn't it?
So, yes and no. There are ways to increase agriculture without straining the environment. It doesn't have to be that way. Grazing is a bit harder, and frankly, I would say that the global population needs to rethink its relationship with livestock, many of which are a huge source of climate emissions, in addition to requiring open land for grazing. Brazil is really struggling with this right now when you have sort of a cultural propensity towards eating, for instance, beef, and that is utterly destroying the Amazon. We have to reckon with that, right? Now, the elephant in the room, so to speak, here is population. India, I believe in March, is about to become the most populous country on the face of the planet. Almost a quarter
Ahead
of
of
the world.
initial estimates, by the way.
Yes, yes. No, it's rah rah. um, well, part of the issue there was China's population fell a little bit faster than we
That's right.
thought, and so India is overtaking just a little bit faster than we anticipated. But it's also true that India's population is still growing. And frankly, it's not just India. Almost a quarter of the world's population lives in South Asia, which is not actually very big in terms of landmass. When I'm talking about South Asia to my students, they're often shocked by how many people live in such a relatively small area, especially when you compare it to, say, Russia, which has a relatively small and shrinking population. Now, if this population continues to grow, as it is, though that population growth is coming down, human environment conflict is almost certainly going to grow as well. Now, like I just said, population growth rates are changing in South Asia, and this may create problems down the road in terms of economics and productivity, but it has to happen if the human environment conflict is to be mitigated. It's also important, I think, to recast the relationship. We are part of the environment. It's not sort of an adversarial relationship and ultimately fully dependent upon it. Currently, I would say in our ignorance of that dependence or our forgetfulness about it, we have essentially set fire to our own house.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the justifications for all this, as you've said too, is that India has a lot of catching up to do with the developed world. And for that, there is a trade off. India needs economic progress, infrastructure, employment, all of that, everything that you've spoken about. Now, Susan, the impression I have is that when it comes to environmental regulation, it's the common citizen who is under scrutiny, who has to comply no matter what. Meanwhile, the most privileged, the largest corporations get away with everything. Is that your view too?
Well, my data certainly supports it. The common citizen certainly is in the weakest position with respect to the law. I can state that pretty definitively. Any sort of legal penalty will affect the common citizen most. The wealthy, whether it be corporations or individuals, can often afford to just say, well, this is a cost of doing business. I will just pay the penalty. It's fine. What my research on compliance, and in particular with this is a different case in the book, teacher student ratio regulations, suggests is that the wealthiest schools are least likely to be in compliance. And my conversations with the administrators in those schools were really interesting. They were completely unapologetic about this. Their view was that they provide a quality education and get their students into the top colleges, and nothing else matters. There's some truth to this too. We have to sort of admit we focus on teacher-student ratio regulations because research suggests that low ratios are associated with better educational outcomes. That's why we're doing it in the first place. But it's not universally true. Some schools are capable of producing well-educated students while ratios are high. So while it's frustrating for your average school administrator that they have to comply at great expense, while wealthier schools often flout the law, if we focus on outcomes, it's maybe not the worst thing in the world. I'll give you another example. So sometimes something that is technically illegal from a regulatory perspective is actually overcompliance in terms of the regulatory goal. So there's a very large tower in San Francisco that was built right next to the Bay Bridge 10 or 15 years ago. Probably, maybe even more than that. I'm dating myself. When it was built, the earthquake engineering was done by one of the preeminent structural engineering firms in the world. It was a cutting edge design, and it was initially rejected by the San Francisco Building Department because it wasn't, quote unquote, to code. In fact, it was actually much better than code. Eventually, it was allowed to proceed. And of course, none of this suggests that we should just let the wealthy do what they want and not hold them to the law. But it does suggest that we should be pragmatic and responsive, and not use the law to undermine sincere efforts that are actually in line with regulatory goals.
Right. And Susan, I'll come to your book in a second. I haven't forgotten about it. But let me touch upon a theme in it. State capacity is often equated with coercion. However, history has shown that it is extremely difficult for states with weak capacity to ensure compliance with their laws. Could you explain that in the Indian context?
Sure. So many scholars and even politicians, bureaucrats, and average people associate the state with coercion, with using force or other means to get its way. If a state is not able to effectively coerce, it supposedly cannot do much. But coercion is really expensive. It really doesn't make sense for a developing country to devote tons of resources towards coercive capacity of the state in particular when it has a whole host of pressing problems. And the thing is, we see the Indian state and other states in the developing world succeeding in regulatory projects that are challenging and unpopular, even when their coercive capacity is not that great. The book I've just finished suggests that this is smart and actually to be commended. There are other less expensive ways to ensure compliance.
Right. So, how does India significantly increase compliance in the true sense? By being pragmatic and by designing implementation strategies.
It sounds maybe facile to say so, but the first step is actually just to be smarter rather than stronger. To lead with on the ground knowledge is what I've found, to work with the populations targeted by particular regulations to find ways to achieve regulatory goals that are compatible with their survival and other needs. In the book, in Capacity Beyond Coercion, I talk about the power to communicate legal norms. I gave a talk actually just on Monday at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. And my discussant, Mekhala Krishnamurti, spoke about work that she's been doing on what she calls relational state capacity. These are very related concepts. And I think it's important to remember that while fear is an effective tool, it is costly and can degrade relationships between state and society. There are other ways to work to secure compliance.
So then tell us about your book. Also tell us how you thought of it and went about researching and writing it.
So the book is an attempt to explain an empirical puzzle that I found somewhat randomly when I went to do some research on Madhesi politics in the south of Nepal. And I was trying to entertain a friend of mine who came to Nepal thinking she was going to the Himalaya, and then I took her to the jungle. So I dropped her off in Chitwan National Park with the idea that she would be able to have a good time. And as I was leaving the park, I saw a map, and that map included Chitwan National Park on one side and Valmiki National Park on the other. And my methodological training kicked in at that point, and I thought, well, that's interesting. 2 different national parks in different countries. I wonder what's going on. How's that working? So I actually quit what I was doing for the day. I walked down to the park headquarters and asked if I could speak to somebody. I had, something like 4 cups of tea later, I did in fact speak to the warden. And what he told me was that there had been very little interaction between the 2 parks, but just recently, and this is about 10 years ago, they had started to talk to one another. And he said it was sort of surprising that they had a lot of forest cover problems there, that a lot of people were taking wood out of the parks. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Why is that? And he said he had no idea. So I thought I would go and check it out myself. So the empirical puzzle is that I went and I saw tons of people going into Valmiki National Park and taking wood out of the park, and relatively few in Nepal. So I was literally just trying to explain this cross-border variation in compliance, given that the populations were so similar on both sides of the border. So same basic basket of ethnic groups and languages, and standard explanations for the lack of compliance found throughout South Asia did not vary along that border. I was simply confused as to why there were fewer people in Nepal sourcing fuel wood in Chitwan than there were doing the same in Valmiki. Now, the book focuses in terms of explanation on inaccurate legal knowledge and what I call poverty-driven noncompliance as compliance barriers. Now, my data suggests that design can change a lot. So design of laws and implementation strategies around barriers can actually achieve compliance in the absence of significant coercive capacity. The book also focuses, just for purposes of generalizability, on teacher-student ratio regulations in the twin border cities of Raxul Bazar and Birganj, where India actually secured higher compliance rates by way of the Right to Education Act, and on child labor regulations, where neither India nor Nepal achieved much in the way of compliance. What I suggest in the book is that when the state behaves pragmatically and designs around known compliance barriers, as with the conservation and education cases, it can realize surprisingly high compliance rates. When it is not pragmatic, as in the child labor case, it does not.
And tell us about your academic work.
Well, how long do you have?
Yeah, all the time in the world. The great thing about podcasts is there is absolutely no time limit.
Excellent. I'll give you the sort of quick version. And this is what I often tell my students as well. I'm a really messy academic. So academia is pretty rigidly, I often use the word feudal. Some people would also use the word siloed, right? We're supposed to stay in our little camps. I am interested in laws and norms and the interplay between them, and I really don't care what disciplinary tradition I have to use or speak to in order to figure that out. So this ends up taking me in all sorts of directions. I work with economists and anthropologists and sociologists and political scientists and lawyers, and I sit in a school of global affairs that is explicitly interdisciplinary, which is fantastic. I've written on all sorts of things. I am a South Asia scholar, so that is my sort of home base in area studies. I've written on intercaste marriage. I've written on FGMC. I've written on the Indian Election Commission, on skin color in Indian politics, etc. So it's a wide range of interests, but all of it does come back to sort of laws and norms and the interplay between them. I do have a new project looking at building code compliance and resilience in the face of earthquakes and storms. So it's really sort of a climate change story. My other new project, which is a book project, asks why coercively capable states sometimes choose not to monopolize violence.
So here's a question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
I have no idea is the honest answer. Sometimes I wonder.
That answer is reserved for journalists. So please continue.
I mean, who can really know, right? In some ways, I would say that my life can be completely explained by serendipity. I ended up being a South Asia scholar by a fluke of history. I was considering studying abroad in a country in Africa. I was studying African politics at the time, and political factors meant that the study abroad program had to go elsewhere. I was given a short period of time to choose another option, and it was suggested to me that Nepal was a good choice. I ended up in Nepal, and my relationship with the region, that was 22 years ago, has only grown since then. So it's in some ways a random story, but I will say this: I love my job, I love my work, and that's frankly enough. It's effortless almost. I just follow the questions, and each project answers some and raises others, and I just keep going. I don't know why. I also really love. So I'm a teacher, and I love empowering others. So teaching is incredibly rewarding and gets me up in the morning.
Susan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you and come back soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And do check out Capacity Beyond Coercion.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINEER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.